People these days seem to always mention the march of progress like it's inevitable, but change rarely comes that easily. Take the Gilded Age, from 1860 to the turn of the century. Indeed, there was a good deal of technological growth, but it came at an enormous cost to the common citizen. Lax government regulation of monopolistic companies and rampant corruption put democracy in jeopardy, not to mention the total disregard for the workers' livelihoods and the surrounding ecosystem. The Progressive Era sought to reform these things. In this time period, the 1890s to the 1910s, the Progressive movement sought to enact reform in many areas, including labor, food safety, and the environment. The progressive presidents that resided over this era were Theodore Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Before the Progressive Era and the advent of regulations to control corporations' greedy and unethical practices, employees did whatever they wanted to make as much money as they could. This meant forcing employees to work long hours for little pay in deplorable conditions. And this meant crushing unions and forming trusts to drive up prices. Early efforts, such as the first Labor Day in 1882, were made to reform these practices, but they were not very successful. Then, a huge wave of legislation was enacted to combat these heinous actions. This came in two parts: trust busting and labor reform. The German Antitrust Act of 1890 prevented trusts, or monopolies, from forming and gave state legislatures the power to govern interstate commerce. However, more had to be done. Enter Roosevelt. He aided in the demolition of the two largest trusts in American history, Northern Securities in 1904 and Standard Oil in 1911. Hence, the Progressive Era changed the future of business in the U.S. Today, corporations must tread carefully when forming partnerships, lest they be dissolved. Creating trusts wasn't the only bothersome thing companies did. For example, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 killed 146 people due to faulty emergency provisions. This was a public incident that incited outrage, which led to mandatory factory inspections. Child labor and woman labor were other problems caused by corporate greed. About 20% of the workforce during the Progressive Era were children aged 10 to 14, and women were overworked. In the landmark 1908 case of Mueller v. Oregon, the state limited women's working hours to 10 hours a day. Food. It's delicious and amazing, and we all need it to survive. So it makes sense that a government, whose job it is to protect its citizens, would ensure that people obtain clean, healthy sustenance, right? However, if you were someone living in the US prior to the 20th century, you'd be in for a surprise.
There would be meat that had tumbled out onto the floor, where the workers had spit uncounted billions of tuberculosis germs. It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried dung of rats.
Famously exposed by journalist Upton Sinclair in his 1906 novel The Jungle, this was the state of the nation's meat. President Roosevelt caught wind of these claims and was thoroughly disgusted and doubtful. These claims were later confirmed, and Roosevelt was convinced that something needed to be done. Thus, on June 30th, 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Federal Meat Inspection Act were signed into law. The former established the Bureau of Chemistry, now known as the Food and Drug Administration, and the latter ensured that all meat was to be inspected by the FDA for proper sanitation.
God never made an ugly landscape. All that the sun shines on is beautiful so long as it is wild.
Environmental activist John Muir affirmed at an 1895 meeting of the Sierra Club. What does this mean? Well, it exemplifies the preservationist and progressive ideal of keeping the land untouched, to remain as it exists naturally. It also means that the beauty of the land trumps any resources that it may contain, and that this grandeur is ruined if it is used for economic gain. But not everyone shared these ideals, and this fight to preserve the wilderness was the greatest overcoming event of the Progressive Era. We're going to define overcoming with 3 criteria. 1. Federal action was taken in favor of the progressive ideal. 2. Few federal actions were against the movement. And 3. The idea gained popularity and support from the people. Many acts were passed for the protection and improvement of American land. Among these were the Forest Reserve Act of 1891, which partitioned national lands for the creation of parks and reserves, the Carey Act of 1894, which gave federal land to the states so long as they improved it, and the Newlands Act of 1902, which allowed the sale of dry western lands wherein the money made was used to irrigate it. Even President Teddy Roosevelt took personal initiative for the cause, allotting over 1 million acres of forest for preservation, setting up the Roosevelt Dam in Arizona for irrigation, and banning Christmas trees in the White House in 1902 to protest logging. But nothing happens without the support of the masses, and the Green Movement bore numerous organizations, such as the Boy Scouts, the Sierra Club, and the National Audubon Society. However, a couple factors worked against this preservation. One of the most egregious was Roosevelt's hypocrisy. He wanted to use the land's resources to stimulate the economy while ultimately keeping its purity. Although there was some controversy, it's clear that the protection of the environment was the overcoming event of the Progressive Era, as legislation was passed and support was garnered, as can be seen in the glory of national parks such as Yosemite. Although there were some controversies and roadblocks, the efforts of progressives were not wasted. The Progressive Era allowed for a multitude of reforms in political, economic, and social areas that solved many of the problems of the Gilded Age. Among these improvements were a stronger regulation of business and labor, reform in the food industry, and better conservation of the environment. Although some efforts only produced results later down the line, the work of progressives sparked the lasting improvement of many areas in American life.